Thanks again for joining us today. As Rob said, this is fairly top level. For a lot of you who are experienced programmers, this will be ground that you are well aware of. But hopefully, it will put things in a different context. I've done this for a while now, and I've seen that even for advanced programmers, maybe they haven't thought about things in a certain way. So what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about a little bit of history. We're going to talk about the cornerstones of console philosophy, basically the decisions that a design team has to make as they sit down to design a new platform. And those decisions, as Rob said, are pretty much, they're universal to every product development team. So there's nothing specific to how EOS approaches a product development effort. There are just some questions that you have to answer. Then we'll get into more EOS-specific things with features that are specifically designed to answer the universal question of why is that light doing that? Because this is all about channel level control and understanding why the light is responding in a certain way based on how you edit it, how you record it, how you play it back. And then we'll just talk about some other miscellaneous things as well. And we'll take breaks periodically where Sam is curating questions, and we will do the best we can to get to those. So kind of to set the stage a little bit more first is like, why do you care about this? The job of a programmer is really multifaceted. In many ways, as you guys know, it's a really difficult job. Part of it is artistic. You are the man-machine interface between the design effort and interpreting what the designer wants and getting that out into the rig. So it's art and data management. And a big part of the job is data management. The closest working relationship you're likely to have is going to be with your design team, seconded to your relationship with your desk. And unlike a human relationship where you and I might work together for a period of time and we will learn one another's shortcuts, and I will learn, for example, with a certain person to avoid a hot button, or if I need them to think about something in a certain way, to approach them in a particular way. And that is how human dialogue works. We learn from each other in terms of the best way to communicate. It doesn't work that way with your desk. The desk isn't going to learn deliberately. So you have to come into the world of the platform that you're working on and understand why it's making the decisions that it's making. So in many ways, your desk is not an equal partner. You're sort of having to learn its language, and it won't learn from you. And a lot of people ask, why is that? And I guess my answer to that is, imagine, we look at logs that you send us, and we know when you're mad. It's obvious in the logs that when you hit clear 25 times, the desk isn't going to think, oh, geez, that's not what they wanted. Maybe I should try this instead. And the reason that it doesn't work that way is because of, imagine autocorrect being deployed live on a stage in front of the entire cast and the orchestra and the production team. The desk isn't going to go, oh, they didn't like that. They're entering the command again, so let me try this instead. We may someday get to a point where, kind of like Amazon, I see that you did this. These are the 5 things that could be leveraged off of this command that you entered that doesn't work. We're not there yet. Even Captain Picard's computers ask for search parameters. So maybe one day we will get to that point, but at the moment, the desk is only doing what the people who coded the software tell it to do. It's not going to understand, oh, this works with channels. I'll bet they want it to work with groups instead. It will only work with groups if it's programmed to work with groups, whatever it may be. So it's kind of a one-way relationship in some ways. And when you are starting, when you've entered the world of lighting control, as many of you have in the digital era, some of the rules that your platform works with, again, whether it's ours or high-end or MA or Strand or whomever you might be using, the rules might feel sort of arbitrary to you, like who made up this thing about tracking and why tracking works the way it works, because it can sometimes feel sort of disconnected. When you take some of those ideas, though, that are not new, back to their origin and look at how they were deployed on the products that they came from, they can actually make more sense to you when you look at them in that way. So not going back too far, depending on your age. So computerized control consoles started showing up around 1975. The first one was used in New York. In the States on Chorus Line, as everyone knows. About that same time, the light board from Strand was installed at the National in London. And things sort of took off from there. So when people started computerizing lighting control consoles, what they basically did was looked at how was product being used today. And they computerized those ideas. They didn't necessarily come up with anything new or different at that time, that's not a pejorative comment. So at the time the computerization happened, there were two basic approaches to lighting in the analog world. And we'll start with the first one because it's the most simple, although it was the second to come along. And that was a preset desk. And that was used throughout much of the world. And I don't know if any of you have ever used these multi-scene preset consoles, but effectively, this is a 3-scene preset desk. The top of faders, the row of faders on the top in white is scene 1. Then you have blue for scene 2 and red for scene 3. Master faders across the bottom. The dimmers are remote, so effectively the left-hand slider on banks 1, 2, and 3 all control dimmer 1. And the way you would do this is you would write out a cue sheet and set up, here's all of Q1 on the top scene, here's all of Q2 on the second scene, here's all of Q3 on the third scene, and then you would crossfade from one scene to the next, and then when you had taken a scene out, you would flip your paper over and madly set up for the cue that was coming. I hope that makes sense. And then there were a lot of other things on here. There, independence and house light controls and work lights and all sorts of things. So basically, though, each dimmer, because we're only dealing with intensity control, of course, each dimmer has multiple input sources because you could have multiple masters open or up at one time. So either scene 1, 2, or 3 could be in control. If multiple masters were giving information, then you sort of have to think about what is the light going to do if it's getting multiple input sources. And you can sort of figure that out if you just look at how you would cue on a desk like this. This is not, in reality, you would have one cue per page, but for the sake of simplicity, what you basically had to do, because you were duplicating each cue on a different bank, you had to write out the entire information for the cue. So you would, for scene 1 or Q1, dimmer 1 is at 50, dimmer 2 is at 50, dimmer 3 is not in use. When I'm going to crossfade to scene 2, I need channel 1 or dimmer 1 to be at 50, so I have to set it at 50 all over again. So you can sort of see some ideas that are coming from this in terms of how we cue today. And those ideas are, navigational problem here. Multi-scene preset operation then gave us 3 ideas that we still use today. One is HTP, highest takes precedence, because a dimmer could have multiple masters controlling it. What was it going to output? It's going to output the highest level it's given because electricity. So that gave us the concept of HTP. We often talk about tracking boards and preset boards. This gives us preset philosophy, where every cue is a completely standalone look. And if I needed to change the level of dimmer 5 in 5 different cues, I had to erase dimmer 5 on a piece of paper, write down the new level, flip the page, erase, write the new level. And it also then gave us an idea that we talk about called state machine, and that refers to, and this is probably the more confusing part, how is the cue being played back? Preset kind of refers to its editing functions, where state refers to when I replay the cue, either through a manual crossfader or through a go button in today's world, what components of the cue are going to be played back. And in a preset style desk, the entire cue is replayed. And this will make more sense when we look at the corollary that we have from piano boards. So that's kind of the basics of multi-scene preset operation. Those were largely used throughout the world, with the exception of pretty much New York and major performing arts facilities in the States that had resistance dimmers, which preceded preset desks. In this instance, every dimmer has just one handle. And you for a cue, and it involved knees, elbows, hips, brooms, all sorts of things to get these handles moved into position. There was a locking mechanism that you could say, dimmers 1, 5, and 6, I want to lock together, and then I'd use one master to adjust the levels, or a wheel sometimes, to adjust the levels together. But for the most part, you were controlling each dimmer individually. And what you got from that then, in terms of the way you cued, because each dimmer only has one input source, you only wrote down the move instructions from one cue to the next, because that's all you care about. You only care about what am I changing when I go from scene 1 to scene 2. So if the first scene is channels 1 and 2 at 50, that's all I have to write down. If Q2 is going to add channel 3 or dimmer 3 to 100 and move channel 2 to 100, all I write down is that. There is no change to channel 1. It stays at 50, therefore I do not reference it at all. You can sort of see now where some corollaries are coming, basically the complete antithesis of a preset desk. The 3 ideas then that come from resistance dimmers, or piano boards, is LTP. The last action that you give a dimmer is what it's going to do. Because there is only one handle for it, it cannot be anything but LTP. In terms of data management, we get the concept of tracking. Things will stay where they are until I tell them to change. It's like I enter a room and I turn on a light switch. That light will stay on until I turn the light off. Tracking is exactly that. And then we get the concept of move fade, which is the antithesis of the state machine. When I hit go or move my fader, my master fader, only the changes in the cues are going to be executed. Anything that is unchanged stays where it is. And this is where we get the concept of move fade. It'd be nice if these auto-paged. So once upon a time, when you were designing a lighting control console, and it's worth noting that in the early days of computerized control, desks fell very neatly into one category or the other. If you were designing a desk that was a preset style system, it was going to be HTTP, it was going to be preset in its data management, and it was going to be a state machine on Playback. That was true of the early ETC consoles, it was true of Quigle Performance, and a host of European products, because tracking is kind of was at the time a uniquely American idea, because resistance dimmers only lived in America, mostly. Or if you were designing a tracking desk, it was always going to be LTP for intensity control. It was always going to be tracking for data management, and it was always going to be move fade. So desks fell very neatly into one category or another in the early days. But you had the decision to make, is it going to be highest takes precedence or last takes precedence? And then what happened with the advent of moving light controls, and people started designing product, they sort of picked and chose ideas that made sense. So now what you see is often intensity will be HTP on certain kinds of playbacks and LTP on other kinds of playbacks, or it's HTP or LTP set optionally. For the most part, non-intensity parameters are always going to be LTP, because HTP doesn't really make that much sense. Is blue higher than red? Who knows? But you started to see a blending of these philosophies where people were picking one or the other. And then once upon a time, a desk was either tracking or non-tracking. That was just the decision that got made. And people, even an early Light Pellet, which was the first tracking console in the States, had a cue-only mode that allowed you to make a change and have it impact only that cue and not subsequent cues. There is a kind of an idea that when you say tracking, you were also defining the playback logic of a desk, and you're not. Tracking has only to do with how cues are stored and how they are later edited. It doesn't define what the playback logic of a desk is going to be anymore. Almost all preset desks that are in the market today have some blend of both preset and tracking philosophy, so that you can kind of fake a track edit function. All tracking desks are going to have some sort of cue-only type function that allows you to make a change and have it impact only that cue. And then once upon a time, all consoles were either move fade consoles or they were state machines. When I hit the go button, only the move instructions are going to be replayed, or when I hit the go button, the entire state of the cue will be replayed. those are, again, from a design perspective, those are your choices. You have options, and always with any console that you're using, certainly at the professional end of the market, you will always have an option to make the desk work in a different way, either persistently or on a queue-by-queue basis. So part of your job as a programmer is to understand the decisions that the design team has made. You don't necessarily have to agree with those decisions, but it's good to know why they made the choices that they made, or even that they did make those choices, so that you can answer the question of why did that light just do that. I hope that mostly makes sense. I think this is the point where we pause for questions that might have accrued. Sam?
We can take a pause here. We currently don't have any questions.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
So we can, if anyone has any, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we can keep moving, and we'll take another pause in a few minutes.
Okay. You guys bear with me. I'm still figuring out what this navigational panel is. So those are kind of the basics that one starts with. Before you write a line of code, you as the designer of a console have to make the decision, what philosophy am I going to follow? And it's not as clean as it used to be in the old days, where, oh, if it's tracking console, it's also going to be move state, it's going to be this. We're now seeing people picking and choosing from those philosophies and blending them together, which is, again, perfectly fine. Once you've made those decisions, though, you sort of have to start thinking about how they play out in the platform that you happen to be creating and, or in your case, using. And the three extensions of those key ideas basically come to what data am I storing, how is it going to be played back, and then how is the data edited. And the storing part is actually more complex than it used to be in the old days, because we now work in a multiple queue list environment almost all the time. Even in the theater, we try to stay on one queue list as long as we possibly can, but for the most part we can't. And so you cannot store the entire state of the rig in your queue list. Otherwise, you could only have one queue list on stage at a time. So then the management of what am I storing becomes a lot more complicated than it used to be. For anybody who knew a session, for example, even though you didn't see zeros everywhere, when you hit record, you were recording the entire state of your lighting rig. Same was true of the original light palette. There are three typical options that one uses today to make the decision of, at a base level, when I store, when am I storing. The first, and probably the most popular amongst moving light desks, is going to be only the manual data, which is the programmer. Hog uses a programmer, MA uses a programmer, many desks do. The idea of the programmer is like a shopping cart. You're going through and as you touch lights, you're picking the parameters that you're touching, you're putting them in your shopping cart, and then when you hit record, you're recording the things that are in your shopping cart. Is effectively what a programmer is. It's very similar to captured channels on an expression console. It's a perfectly fine way to work. It's very efficient. Another way to program what is stored, and again, a lot of desks will use combinations of these things, is only the lights that are active. And when we talk about active, we mean the intensity is above 0. And that actually, although I talk about this as the very lightweight because that's where you can trace its origins, it's used as an option in a lot of different consoles. EOS does not support that at the moment. Well, you could if you select active, I guess. And we call it the very lightweight because back in the day, because this will play itself out in a couple of other ideas in time, very light in its early systems, the Series 200 and 300, the lights stored their queue data. The desk actually had no visibility into the queue structure. So what would happen is that you would set the lights to do a thing. The lights knew what they were doing. The desk was only going to be sending go commands. So when you hit record queue, whatever, the light would say, oh, do I store this or not? Because back in the day, processing was expensive. So you wanted to not store data that you didn't care about. And so on a Verilight system in the early days, when you hit record, the light would only store the queue if it was turned on. And that's how it knew it cared about what it was doing. So that is why we call it the very light way. This will play itself out in marking in a little bit. And then you also have store the entire state of any lights that are in use, which is the way EOS does it. And I can't speak for other platforms, but I'm sure that there are others who do it as well. So the default when you use a record function on an EOS is I'm going to record any light that I have touched, and I'll record the entire state of it. And it's Again, it's an alternative. It's not the only way to do things. It's the way we chose. The advantage of that, though, in my mind, is that if I want to store the entire state of the fixture, I don't have to tell it that. It knows that by virtue of the record function. There is a corollary in EOS to the programmer, which is record only, which only stores manual states. And we see a lot of people actually do use that combined with captured channels, which sort of emulates a programmer style behavior. If that's the way you like to work, in combination with a setup option that is disabling auto playback on record. It's not exactly equivalent, but it's sort of similar. And again, whatever platform you happen to be working on, there are going to be options to make the desk work in a different way than it will natively. And so it's kind of on you to learn what those different things are going to be. I usually said this earlier, Nick has this thing that he calls a lizard brain, because as we know in programming, it's all about time. It's time and accuracy. And you have to get these concepts so deeply embedded in your own consciousness that you don't have to think about them, because there isn't time to think about them. And so that's one of the reasons why we sort of beat on this topic a little bit. So then there is also then what is playback? Again, you only really have two choices. I want to play back the entire state of the queue. I only want to play back the move instructions. We are a move play desk. Most desks are state machines. In either way, there is going to be an option not to make it work that way. Hog has a concept called, or a function called persist on override. For us, a way to make a queue or a queue list or a queue part play back all of its values, including its tracks when you hit go, is to assert the queue. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. So there is always going to be a way to make it work differently. And then, so this is on an EOS, when you assert, you can assert at a queue part or you can assert at a queue level. And what you'll see in the playback status display, this is associated with Q4, under the queue flags section, you'll see a capital A. That means that the queue is fully asserted, so that when I hit go, even the tracked values will be replayed. Why do I care about this? Maybe I've been working on something and those lights got taken away by a second queue list, and now I need them to come back. And I need them to come back into my primary queue list at the same value they were originally at. So I'm not going to give them a move instruction because they're at the same value they were before they were stolen. I just need them to return to me now, and that's what an assert will do. You can also assert at a channel level or a parameter level, and this is what it looks like. It's assert flag when you, just like anything you do at a channel level in EOS, could work differently on whatever platform you're on. You'll get a red A in superscript that tells you put an assert flag and you still have to update or store the queue. When you do that, then you'll get a lowercase a in the playback status display in the flags field that tells you that that queue is partially asserted. It's got channel level asserts on it. So then the last thing that you really have to choose is how is the data going to be edited? Is it going to be a preset style desk so that every change that I make, I have to make in each queue that I want to make it? Is it going to be a tracking system where I make a change and that change will propagate forward to the queue list until a transition is encountered? Again, all desks are going to have an option for letting the desk work the other way, kind of. It's worth noting that in EOS, this is not true of all tracking systems. In EOS, changes that you make in blind are automatically stored. Therefore, any changes that you make at channel level in blind, you have to append the queue only or track instruction that overrides whatever your setup option has been at a channel level, where when you're working in live, you do that when you hit record or update. So one of, I hope this is making sense. So one of the misleading statements that you often hear in our industry is that if you put a tracking desk into queue only mode, it's turning it into a preset desk. Or if you do a track edit on a preset console, it's turning into a tracking desk. That is not a true statement. The fundamental nature of the desk is still going to persist, and let me explain why. And I'm going to use the examples of obsession and expression because I think a lot of you have experience on both of those platforms or one of those platforms. Imagine that you've written 20 queues and you've got, just for math, to be easy, channels 1 through 20 at a value. And then you go on and do other things. And then you decide, oh, I need a Q 4.5. Maybe you're doing a corporate event where all of a sudden the CEO is going to come out and speak, and you're like, oh, I need to like do a podium cue here. And you know what the values need to be, so you don't need to see it on stage. So you do, or you set the values in podium and you decide I want to selectively store them. So you say, and let's say the podium is channel 55. Channel 55 at full, record Q 4.5. So you've inserted this brand new Q in the middle of your Q stack of 20. What's going to be in Q 4.5? Depends on the desk. If it is an expression style system or a true preset console, only that channel will be in Q 4.5, and any values for channels 1 through 20 that were coming from Q4 will be driven to 0, because that's the nature of a preset desk. This is all I want. If you did that very same thing on a tracking console, every tracking console, by the way, this channel will record Q 4.5, you will end up with that channel at whatever value it is, and everything from Q4 will track in, because that is the fundamental nature of a tracking desk. And that is true even if the desk is in Q-only mode. Q-only only says, when I make a change, do I want that change to propagate forward through my queue list? Doesn't have anything to do with how data might be coming into the queue list, which is defined by preset versus tracking. So that's kind of worth taking note of. Oh, shoot, I skipped a bunch there, didn't I? I'm sorry, sorry, bear with me. So that's kind of how preset and tracking remain different even when you might have set a queue-only flag on a tracking console. The thing that we always recommend to people is, if this is confusing to you in the least, and I'm sure that it will be until you get your head around it, because tracking scares a lot of people, it is an incredibly efficient way to work when you understand it. Having said that, it is not appropriate for every type of gig you might be doing. Sometimes preset or queue-only desks, or a tracking desk in queue-only mode, will be more efficient for you. We always recommend going to blind spreadsheet, make changes, see how those changes propagate forward through your queue stack, delete queues, both tracking and queue-only, insert queues, see what happens. And then, if you're not getting the results you want, find out, for whatever desk you happen to be using, how to get them. For example, EOS has a function that, going back to that Q 4.5 that I inserted, if I actually wanted to drive all the values from Q4 out, I can. This channel record Q 4.5 Remdim. Again, not that many people know that, but it exists, and any tracking desk is going to give you options like that, and it's kind of on you to learn whatever platform you're working on and what options they present to you for controlling how this works, hopefully. So one of the related functions to tracking is called blocking, and I think everyone is fairly conversant in blocking. It's worth taking a look at, though, because it is, we talked about assert earlier as a way to take a tracked value, and for the purposes of playback, treat it like a move instruction, which is basically what assert is doing. And in Obsession and original Light Palette, a block function was both a block and an assert. So for it would keep data from tracking into a queue list, which is what block does. And also, when you hit go, it would assert that value. In EOS, we split them up into two separate features because a lot of designers told us that when they were working with Obsession, one of the things they had to do after the show was in the can was go back and remove blocks so that they could get the show to play back the way they wanted it. So we decided to split them into two features. So blocking is the editing corollary of assert. Blocking, just like an assert, can be done at a queue level, a queue part level, a channel parameter level. So Rob went into my PowerPoint here earlier and put little nice circles around it. When you block at a queue level, you will get in the flags field of the PSD, and again, whatever desk you're working on, they're going to give you some indication, so you have to know what that indication is. We'll give you a capital B that tells you that you fully block the queue. So blocks intensities and non-intensity parameters. We also can just do an intensity block, which is often what people want to do, and you do that with shift block. It's the fastest way to do it, and you'll get an I that tells you that you have just block the intensity parameters. You could also obviously do that with, select active intensity block at a channel level. A partial block is, oh, sorry, did I skip that? Yes, no, I didn't. A partial block is when I've blocked at a channel level or a parameter level. So I've just done the thing of these channels, color, block, enter. You'll get a lowercase b that tells you that the queue is only partially blocked. One of the things that people often get confused about in EOS land, and Obsession works this way, I can't speak with any authority about other tracking consoles and how they handle this, but EOS has a function called auto blocking, and you guys have probably seen it. It's when the data appears with a white, it's in white, which is how blocks are represented, with an underscore. That's an auto block. Auto blocks are not a bug. It is by design. And what it does is an auto block is created. Let's say I've got queue 25 and channel 55 is at 50. So it's a move instruction, transition to 50. And I later go back in a previous queue and I set that same channel to 50%. EOS is going to auto block that channel in the original queue because it wants to maintain the idea of a transition. You had a transition here, whether it was up, down, or whatever, there was a change. And just because you later go back and match the level, we want to maintain the concept of a transition here. So that if for some reason you didn't block a queue, if that level was now matched and you went back and changed it, you don't want it to blow through. I hope that makes sense. So we will auto block that because you had a transition there and we're protecting the concept of a transition. Some people think it's a bug, some people think it's a feature. It seems to be market dependent as to how people feel about it. There is a cleanup function that allows you, auto block cleanup soft key, that allows you to clean up the entire queue list, just in queue ranges or whatever. So it is one of those things that is worth, again, understanding why the desk is doing it. It's trying to protect you in a sense. So it is a feature, not a bug.
And can I hop in here too?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Yeah, I think this is an important point to bring back to your earlier statement, which is that if you have auto blocks throughout your show, blocking only affects edits, right? And that includes auto blocks. So this is only going to affect how your data is edited, not how it's played back. So if you have auto blocks in your show and your show is playing back properly, as long as they're not bothering you, you don't need to go remove them. They can stay there for the whole playback. So just keep that in mind. Blocking only affects editing. It doesn't affect playback.
Yes. Thank you. So it is, blocking is the playback. It is a playback. Yeah, I'm sorry, not speaking English today. Assert then is a companion to blocking, right? I think we've kind of hit that. One of the key questions that we still get today, and we always pointed out in training, why can't I get a blackout on this stuff? And this was something that came up in the early days in the phone calls I took from designers of, I can't get a blackout on your console, tell me why. And it's because blocking is not the same as it was. Because assert is the thing that you use for controlling playback. So when we are all in the habit, I think, of blocking our blackout queues because we certainly don't want anything tracking in to not make it a blackout. You should also get in the habit of asserting it, and this is the reason why. Let's assume that I'm about to go to a blackout. They're going to call the blackout. It's going to be on a bump. I already have down, upstage right fading to 0 over a nice slow count because we're doing a transition, and it's fading, fading, fading. They call the bump to black. So these lights are already fading to 0. I call the bump to black. Those lights, because they're not getting a new instruction, they were already on their way to 0 over 20 seconds. They're not getting a new instruction. They're going to continue moving to 0 in 20 seconds because the blackout queue is not telling them anything new because blocks don't act as playback instructions. So if you want to make sure that on that bump to black, any lights are going to actually bump to black, you need to assert that. And that basically says everything that is in this queue, even if it is a tracked value, needs to be treated as a move instruction. So that's just good practice. We had actually early on in EOS talked about whether we should automatically apply an assert flag every time you put a block flag on, and we decided not to do that. I think it's all draconian. But it's a good note to yourself. I think we're kind of past those days of people not understanding this, but worth hitting if you're new to the platform. Again, whatever platform you happen to be working on, they're going to be similar rules. They'll be different because consoles are not all the same, but you kind of need to know how you're going to control this. So again, pause, see if anything.
So we're going to start kind of work our way backwards with the stuff that is most current, and then we'll get to some questions that are from some earlier material.
Okay, and this is where I'm also, because again, I tend to explain stuff in a very specific way that might not be appropriate. Ask Rob and Nick to feel free to chime in to help explain things.
Great. Yeah. So let's see. Kyle would like to know, will an auto block clean up if you go back to that queue again and create a different value in the first queue so that there is a true move instruction again?
Yes, it will.
And I'll just add, in our level 1 training, we specifically do that example. So if you haven't seen our level 1 training book, take a look in there and you'll see exactly how that works.
It's kind of magic, actually.
Next question, why do some NPs have auto block values that will not be represented by an auto block mark? These can't be cleaned up, question mark?
Do you have an example?
We will,
Or if
well,
you have an example
well,
show file, you can send it to us, maybe?
Yeah. I think in case they have something in mind, I have a couple questions here asking for an explanation of Remdim, so maybe we can start there, and then if we get a follow-up, we'll do that.
Okay, and yeah, we'll think about so Remdim is a legacy feature, and it was typically used back in the day for troubleshooting your rig. By the way, did you know you can disable the Remdim button? Because you can, which is a common feature in our feature requests, especially from the television market. So Remdim basically says, channel 1 at full Remdim. We'll take the rest of the stage out. And then you can next. It's kind of like it sits between highlight and a dimmer check, or channel check, really. And it's a way just to isolate the stage so you can look at something. You can, if you make changes from that, you're basically abandoning Remdim. So anything that you had driven out, and I think this works pretty consistently across all platforms. I can't guarantee you that. So every desk has it. It's worth checking whatever platform you work on. I can only speak with authority about ES, well, and sometimes not even that. So Remdim is just a way to say take everything else out. And we deployed it, maybe 10 years ago for record functions. And here's how this came about. There's always a story behind everything, right? In the early days of Element, we did, and maybe Ion, I can't remember, we did a one-to-one sub-to-channel map. I don't know if you guys remember that. Submaster 1 always had channel 1 automatically stored in it. It was an option, I think, when you opened a new show file. And it was a way to get around the fact that we didn't have channel faders, so it must have been Ion that we did this for. And then people would go to record their Submaster, and because oftentimes when you're recording subs, you're doing selective storing, these channels record the sub, they'd end up with that core channel being left in there. So the only way to deal with it was to delete the Submaster before you stored it. It was just a nightmare. So we added this Remdim feature that you could say these channels record the Submaster Remdim, which is if there is anything else in there, take it out. And which is not a bad way, by the way, when you're dealing with selective storing the subs anyway, to know that you're basically deleting at the same time you're storing. And then we expanded that to queues so that when you're recording queues, you can say, these channels record queue whatever, Remdim, and it will drive anything that might be tracking from the previous queue, only intensities, by the way. It will drive those values to 0. So again, going back to kind of the example before, let's assume I'm doing a corporate gig and I've got all these queues recorded, and then they decide, the CEO will come out at the podium here, and I don't want to do it off of a Submaster for whatever reason, although I could. I need to insert a queue here. I can then just bring up that podium light and record it in Remdim, or do it in blind, because Remdim can be applied in blind. And it will drive out any intensity values that might track forward from the previous queue. Does that make any sense? Nick or Rob, do y'all have anything to add that might help? I'm not being clear. No.
Okay, next.
And this is one of those things, you know, here's the thing about control. Sometimes the more you talk about it, the more complicated it gets. What I would recommend is if there's any like confusion, which I can imagine that there is, try it and see what happens. Try it in blinds at a channel, you know, try it when you're recording a cue and see what happens. It will be helpful, I think.
Next question. When going through a cue list and cleaning up auto blocks, what is the difference between block enter, and using the auto block cleanup?
There isn't. Block enter will first block everything and then unblock everything. Auto block cleanup only, well, there is kind of actually, because the auto block cleanup only looks at things that are auto blocked. Where block enter will take anything, block it first, and then unblock it.
I think the big difference that I've seen is that if you're doing block enter over a range of cues, that can be destructive to blocks that you have or intensity blocks or things like that. So auto block cleanup is good for range cleaning, right? You know, on a single cue, block enter will toggle it one way and then the other, on or off. Again, if that's an intensity block, you'll have to re-intensity block it. But specifically when you're doing auto block cleanups in a range, like for a full scene, you have to be really careful because if you have blocks in there, that can be destructive. So auto block cleanup's a lot safer.
And then I'll just mention one of the favorite features we added at some point in the past. You can auto block clean up an entire cue list all at once. So you can say Q1/auto block cleanup, and then you're done. You don't have to remember your starting and ending cues or select a range.
Okay, thank you guys. Sam, anything?
Yes, we have plenty of more questions. We have a little bit more on Remdim. So talk a bit about what you do after you invoke the Remdim. How do you use to after you have driven the existing values to 0?
Well, for manual control or for cue recording?
I'll hop on, Anne, if you don't mind.
Please,
Remdim is a manual tool, right? So using Remdim will put manual values on you know, all of your channels. So it doesn't have anything to do with recording or playback. It's just for manual control.
Sorry, we sort of hijacked that tool, right, yeah, from its original purpose, which is where I think some of the confusion is coming. Sorry, Nick.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah, and I think that from an EO standpoint, you have a couple of options. You can hit Remdim immediately after again, and it will undo that Remdim. So again, as Anne was saying, it was used to sort of check lights in a rig. By hitting Remdim again immediately after you've used it, it will undo that Remdim command only, which is really useful. But other than that, if you move on from that command, you have a bunch of manual value that you need to deal with, store, sneak, do whatever you're going to do with it.
But once, you know, Remdim can be pretty destructive because once you start making changes in a Remdim state, you're locked in that Remdim state. And I think it's a feature that we should look at in the future because with this was before the advent of tools like Highlight, that it could be possible that it's time for Remdim to go away as a functional tool. Nick is nodding. Rob is nodding. We might get a little poll going because I think that it made sense at a certain time in our lives, and I don't think it necessarily does anymore. That it adds more confusion and danger than it helps, essentially. So, but as I said, in terms of recording, we sort of just, oh, look, there's a Remdim button. We could use it for that purpose. Not what it was really designed to do, by the way.
So, working a bit further back, Jay would like to know, what is the reason for single-state playbacks, such as Submasters, when a lot of consoles you simply have a single cue on a separate cue list? I argue that this increases consistency in settings and is easier to add extra states if needed.
Some of it's legacy, right? The ETC products have always had Submasters. And I you know, this will be interesting for Rick and Nick and Rob to add in as well. So some of it's legacy. Some of it's also, I don't have to worry so much with Submasters, right? They're very purpose-built. I can put conditions on them that I can't put on cue lists, such as shielded states, so that if I have lights that I need dynamic control over, they're kind of like I want to park them, but I need dynamic control over the park level, I can dump them on a shielded submaster and have live control over them. And I can keep them from being recorded into anything else by excluding that submaster from recording. So I understand the point, and I know that a lot of desks don't do submasters. I think for our particular user base, they have a use for them, and they think of them in a different way. Is that?
Yeah, and I think, again, because we cover a lot of different market spaces with EOS, I think one of the most advantageous things that's different between queue, like playback data, and submaster data is what happens on stage if you make an edit in blind. So if you're not aware, in EOS, if you make an edit in blind to a queue that's currently on stage, that playback is protected. You have to reload that queue for that change to go out on stage. And that's very intentional. So you can go in and be making edits and tracks and things further up, and that doesn't necessarily affect what's being played back on stage. Submasters, when you make an edit in them, they go live to stage immediately if they're active. And so a lot of TV and film market will use that to their advantage, where this submaster is a particular look for talent or whatever, and they can add and remove fixtures live to that submaster, and the playback will take effect immediately. So there is a playback advantage based on how EOS has deployed those. And I think that that's advantageous once you know that to different market spaces. So.
Yeah, one of the reasons it's used so heavily in television and film is that the changes that you're making in the submaster buffer are automatically filtered in a sense, and you don't have to record or update them, so you don't have to worry about getting stuff in the sub you don't want, which is one of the reasons I think, historically, they've come to rely on that tool for that purpose. And that's the reason that we keep submasters. But it's a good question.
A lot of people saying they would not like it removed. And I know, Anne, for you just listen to what people want, and that's when you make your changes. That's just. Yeah,
we're gonna get rid of them.
Wholly based on people's feedback. We're going back to the old keyboard. Everything's gonna change. It's gonna be great.
No, but, we'll get rid of HTTP though. We'll keep them. Get rid of HTTP.
That'll be your final mission, is to kill HTTP for all time.
It is. Be my parting shot.
Working backwards, there are a bit more questions on some of the earlier material that I don't want to get kind of left out. Isaac's question, he has a question about AB faders. So he says, why does EOS have a master AB fader even though it isn't a preset desk? Do they function differently than they would in an HTTP system?
They do, because that is a really good question though, because it is a subtle difference. An AB fader on a preset console, you are fading one cue out and you're fading the other cue in. So you're getting rid of the, just like you would on preset console, where I'm taking the values being provided by this, fading it down and fading these up. And it used to be back, and this is, you guys are way too young to remember this, but in marketing materials, there used to be a big thing about desks having dipless crossfaders. Does anybody remember that phrase? Because in early analog systems, and even computerized consoles that were preset desks, you could actually see, when you hit go, you could see lights are starting to fade down and others are fading up. You'd see the cues were being replaced, right? But the value for the channel didn't really change from one cue to the next. You'd actually see a dip until the incoming cue took over the value. And so companies made a big deal out of having dipless crossfaders. Oh, if the value isn't changing whatsoever, you're not going to see anything on your stage. But you're actually taking a cue, on an AB fader pair, you're taking a cue out and bringing another cue in. On a tracking style desk, or a move fade, which is a move fade, it is actually move fade philosophy, the left fader is controlling the intensities that are fading up. Is that right? And the right fader is controlling intensities that are fading down in non-intensity parameters. So that if you wanted to speed up the lights that are transitioning higher, you have control over that. I don't know that many people who actually use those faders anymore. Certainly in Europe and America, I think they're more heavily used in the East because that's why we put so much effort into manual control functionality for the master playback faders. There's a lot of logic that sits in there. But you're controlling the lights that are fading up versus the lights that are fading down, not one cue replacing another cue. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, we get a lot of, because a lot of people, we get a lot of feedback about, do you want to cover why we don't allow those to be assigned to other things?
Sure.
We get a lot of requests about that.
Sure. Knock yourself out. Go ahead.
Oh, I have to explain it?
You brought it up.
I will say what I think is right, and then you can tell me that I'm completely wrong. One of we do get a request of like, oh, I want to be able to assign something different to those faders because a lot of people aren't using them for splitting manual crossfades. And the biggest difficulty is showing you what is on those faders, right? So, on the L5, we moved to a dedicated fader display. There is, in 3.0, if you're playing in there, we've allowed expansion of the fader module in MGO and TI. So it's difficult to show you what's on those faders so that you know what you're going to do when you activate them. But that's something that's always being discussed. And I think that over time will be something we might loosen up on, not tomorrow, but long term.
Yeah, for a big thing for us is displaying for you what is happening. And we get the question all the time, why can't I make the bottom fader be an executor for this cue list and the button above be an executor for that cue list, and then the fader be a manual fader for this cue list, and then the top button be yet a fourth cue list, right? And the reason that we haven't gone there at this point is a display. It's completely about display. How are we going to tell you all of those things? And as we are modifying the tools, and some of the tools were driven, like the fader ribbon, TI and Geo, were driven by the physical constraints of Classic. And now that, because you had the button modules that could sit above that area, so we were kind of limited to this little tiny strip that we could use for the fader ribbon. Now that moving into 3.0, now that we don't build for Classic anymore, we're really changing a lot of those graphics considerations that we were kind of hemmed into by this, 16, 17-year-old piece of hardware. So we'll see where we go from there, because I think that we probably will be taking a look at that again. But for us, it's always about how are we going to tell you what's happening? So,
great. Next question from Colin. What does light in use mean in the context of EOS record? Has a command on any parameter from any source?
Yes. Yes, it doesn't matter what the source is. You can modify that. So if I have a light up that's, it's a submaster, and all it does is bring the intensity up for that fixture. If I record a cue from that state, I'm going to record the entire state of that fixture because it's in use. If I have a completely clean stage, and my favorite example of this is always Bringing the Noise, Bringing the Funk on Broadway, where the opening cue was a VL4, pointed straight down on Savon Glover. It was in open white, open beam, zoom at like 50%. So it was intensity and zoom were the only two parameters that were used. So that's all you would set for the fixture. And when you record the first cue on an EOS system, it's going to record the fact that the light is in open beam, it's in open white, pan and tilt is homed, because you use record. If you use from a programmer, again, not pejorative, this is not a bad thing, it's just a different thing. If you were only storing the manual data, you would store just the fact that the light was at some value and the zoom was at some value. Again, not a bad thing, just a different thing. So you have to think about it differently. That make sense?
Yeah. Let's see.
There's no bad decisions. There are only different decisions, right?
I've got a question that is both in the chat window and in the Q&A window that has to do with if Remdim didn't exist, a lot of people in theater in particular use it as a quick way to get down to a single light or a group of lights. So the syntax is channels 1 through 5 at full, Remdim, enter. We'll have Remdim. We'll turn channels 1 through 5 to full and take everything else to their Remdim level, which by default is 0. So what would you do instead of that? Something that is similar in syntax length would be to use either select active or your channel selection. So to say channels select active minus 1 through 5 out. So it's a different way to think about it. But if in a world where Remdim didn't exist, and again, this isn't like we're not talking about tearing off tomorrow, right? And a lot of people use it. So, but that is a syntax that also would function in EOS, which is to say, give me all of my lights that are active, so your select active button, minus the ones that I want to keep on, 1 through 5 in this example, out. So that would be a way to get the same result as a Remdim key.
It is. I mean, it's an interesting philosophical question, though. As control grows, and as the rigs that we're controlling change, I do think as product designers, we have to be willing to look at legacy features and ask if in the modern world, do those features make sense anymore? Because as you continue to add things that you need for control of a modern lighting rig, then you run into these things that are so close to one another: dimmer check, channel check, Remdim, highlight, HTP versus priority states. I do think that in order to keep the logic of any platform that you have sort of from becoming bloviated, it is worth, even if you decide to make no changes at all, to be talking about those things. Is this something, do people use it because they've always had it, or do they use it because it's the only way to get something done, or the fastest way? And so when we talk about these things, we're not like, oh, tomorrow we're going to get rid of this. But I do think it's an interesting thing to look at those functions from long ago and ask ourselves about the relevance of them. And for the most part, we always end up with, yes, we still need it. We'll see.
Tony has been sitting on this question, being very patient for a while. He would just he's a little fuzzy on the concept and definition of the mood fade desk versus state desk. When is one more advantageous than the other? It's a good point. It is always the most confusing thing. I'll tell you what, no, one is not more advantageous to the other. As I said, I don't think that there are necessarily good or bad decisions in this realm. I think that there are only different decisions in this realm. And EOS is one of the few move fade desks on the market. And one of the reasons it's a move fade desk, maybe it will help if I explain why we made that decision. To me, because I am all about tracking logic, despite having worked on platforms that are not tracking style desks, move fade is not the same as tracking, but it's a logical extension of tracking. Because it basically says things only happen when I tell them to happen, right? That's what tracking is. A light is going to stay on or at this value until I tell it to do something else. To us, as we were figuring out the logic for EOS, and we spent a lot of time on this, trying to figure out what the right decision was, it was a natural extension that says, okay, well, that, to me, that logic makes sense then in playback world as well. When I hit go, only the lights that I have told to do something are going to actually do something. So for me, it's a logical extension of tracking. It's not inherently better or worse than a state machine. It's just a different way to handle the data. Because you have, whether you're working on a state style desk, I hit go, and I want the entire everything to play back. Well, if I didn't want to grab stuff back from another fader, I have to go over to that fader and give it a higher priority. I have to knock those channels out of this queue list for some period of time until I then want them back, and I have to figure out what value were they at. Or in our world, you have to assert. So there's the same amount of work to manage playback. You're just doing different work to manage playback, if that makes any sense. Is that, Nick and Rob, fair? Anything to add? Okay. It's a really great question. And I think with that, we will move on and we will try to get to some of these questions at the end. There's just a lot here and we have a lot to go over. So
yeah, Sam, thank you. One of the things we talked about, guys, earlier in the week was a way to circle back with you about questions that we might not get to address during this, because we have like 50 minutes left, and we'll try to move through the rest of this because it's very specific as fast as we can, but we will try to close the loop on anything that doesn't specifically address.
Yeah, I know not everybody's perhaps in the Facebook group, but I've been trying to think of a way to like get these answers out to everybody who may have been in this call, because we don't we don't really have like a centralized location. I might try and start posting them in the EOS Programmers Facebook group and see if that works, but I'll also look if there's an option to put them on our website. I'd have to talk to our web team about that, but we do want to, as we do more of these, if we don't have time for questions, we do want to get to all of them. So we're trying to figure out a mechanism for that. So stick with us and we'll figure it out.
Hey, so we're going to move on to the section that really talks more about trying to answer the question of why is that light doing that, which is kind of what all of this is about, right? Why is that light on? Why is it over there? Q5 told it to be there. EOS has, and again, any desk you work with is going to have very similar tools, because we're all trying to answer the same question. We're all trying to solve the same problems in control. So it's not surprising at all that we're all ending up with similar solutions to problems, right? We have a variety of different controls for trying to help you figure out why is that light doing that. And one of them is a ridiculous number of display toggles that you remember just the ones you care about and forget the rest. One is about an address will display the output address of that particular channel. If you're in Tombstone view, it will give you pluses, summary views with pluses, and if you're in table view, it will give you the actual address on a per parameter level. About in live displays the output value. That is who is telling it. No, wait, sorry. About in queue displays the source. So what queue is telling it to be this, or what submaster? You can hit that. About and data will display manual stored data that's sitting behind a manual value. So let's say you've made a bunch of manual overrides and you're not sure if you want to keep them or not. What was the stored value in the queue to begin with? You can hit that and it will, it was stored at this value. Maybe it wasn't enough of a change that you actually care about it. About and mark is supposed to be displaying the mark queue number, or the R queue, the reference queue. It's broken, just so you know. Although I said we didn't want to talk about bugs in this, I found one. I thought I should tell you about it. And about and label will toggle reference data between the target number and the label. So in each of your views, you can set up whether for reference data, palettes and presets, do I want to see the number, color palette 15, or do I want to see the label, R80? You get to make that decision. Whatever you have the display set to, about and label will toggle it to the alternative view. These things are really handy when you're trying to answer questions about a lot of channels at one time. About in park will display the park value, without you having to go to the park buffer. About in part displays the part structure. So if you are using multi-part queues, which many people still do, they definitely have a purpose. It will tell you which part everything was commanded to a level by. And about in time displays discrete timing. And more. About path, if you're using color path, it will tell you what the color path deployed was. You get a P that tells you that a path has been deployed, but it doesn't tell you which one. And this was one of my favorites that I think a lot of people don't know about. About and next or last will display, depending on the button that you use, the next or last queue that a parameter is going to be moved in. So it's the same information that's presented to you in about, but you can see it for a whole bunch of channels at one time. So if you're not familiar with those are pretty handy tools for helping answer that question that we get asked all the time. And then kind of at a more granular level, so the display toggles are really, I need to see this for a bunch of lights. About, if you're not in the habit of using that, is a really handy tool for more detailed information at a per channel or per record target level. We'll focus on the channels because that's what we're talking about in this presentation, our discussion. A lot of our programmers will leave about open, locked open all the time because they find it that useful. So, and again, these are really small, so you have to come look. This is the standard channel about window. It's going to tell you what the channel label is. It gives you information about its previous intensity move, its next intensity move. If anything is inhibiting it, one of the things we're doing in 3.0 is adding another level of inhib information. It tells you for every parameter, what is its current source, what value is it. If it's in a reference, then it's going to tell you what the absolute data is, what the DMX output is, if it's got discrete timing or delays, what queue it's marked in, and what queue it's marked for. So it's going to give you, just at a glance, quite a bit of information about that channel. Then there are a series of toggles along the left side of the About screen. This is background values. So basically this says, if I were to remove this queue, or whatever it is that's telling this light to be doing whatever it's doing, what would it do instead? So this is going to report in, if I take this value away, what is the light going to do? What is its background state? And as you guys know, in fader config, you have a lot of decisions now that you have to make about who is going to be a background state, whether something is available as a background state. When you remove content, what should it do? Should it fade to its minimum value? Should it go to its background state? So this is a place that will help you figure out what happens if you take a queue away, or Submaster. This is your moves field. It tells you on a parameter level what the previous move was and its value, what the next move is by target. Again, only within one queue list, because we can't really figure out where you're going when you're going between multiples. What its value is, and again, it's going to give you the background information in this as well. Refresh, this is the usage tab. It tells you this particular channel, what submasters is it used in, what queues is it moved in, does it have dark move instructions, and what queues is it active in. The dark moves, you know, we get feedback from, and I didn't do a screenshot on this, but we get feedback a lot of times that people feel the PSD is yelling at them, because we have a flag for moves in V, which is moves, and L will present if you have a live move. That means I'm bringing intensity up from 0, and I also have non-intensity parameters moving. Maybe you want that, and maybe you forgot to light them, to mark the light, right? We have a dark moves flag. For the most part, EOS tries really hard not to move things that don't need to be moved, because that increases noise in the venue, and we try to avoid that. So if you have a dark move, that is non-intensity parameters moving when the light is off, we will flag that as with a D for a dark move. And that happens all the time, right? Because we work in a hurry. Bring this light up, focus it downstage left, put it in this color palette. Oh, never mind, kill it. So then you set it to 0, and then you record the cue. What you really should have done is sneaked it, but who has time? So then you end up with a dark move stored in that queue. So you have an unnecessary move. So the dark move is trying to tell you that. It will tell you that these channels need to be cleaned up if you so choose to get rid of that field in the PSD that you think is yelling at you. Patch information, again, at a per channel level without going into patch. These are fixture nodes. So if whatever the latest rev to the fixture library was, anything that you need to know about that particular fixture profile that you have patched. And then these are your lamp controls. I think all of you guys are familiar with lamp controls and the fact that we don't store them as control channels by design. And then I threw in this kind of at the last minute, again, a tool that a lot of people find incredibly useful, but if you're not in the habit of putting it in your workflow, you might be bypassing it. Sorry for you guys who don't use EOS. We're going into very EOS-specific things at the moment. But the desk that you work with might have something similar, probably does. Query is a way, it's a channel, give me information, or select channels based on condition. And that condition is it currently doing this, which is by default. It isn't currently doing this. It could be doing this, means it has stored data for this, or it can't be doing this, it doesn't. And then there are a bunch of modifiers. And the example I give for this is, I sit in theaters all the time where someone needs a light for a purpose, and they go through and they look to see if it's available for this range of cues that they need it for, and then they start programming, and all of a sudden the light goes off and does a thing as it was told to do. So let's say I need a light from downstage, from front of house that can get downstage left. Let's say it's focus palette 1, and I could use it. I need it in cues 20 through 30. So I can query can be focus palette 1, can't be cues 1 through 30, or whatever cue range I said. And what that says is, it can be means it's recorded in focus palette 1, can't be is it's not recorded in this cue range. So that tells me return to me a list of lights that are available that can hit this part of the stage as defined by focus palette 1 or whatever that isn't used in this range of cues. And it will select those channels for you, and then you can pick the one that you want. Going to the dark moves flag, I need to remove the dark moves. Okay, now I don't want to go look for them. You can query for dark moves, and it's going to highlight the channels or select the channels that have dark moves, enter them, and magically your dark moves have gone away. I forgot to mark some lights. Query for live moves, and you can do this in ranges. Channels, query 1 through 20 live moves. Give me those channels that have live move instructions. So basically, any condition that the light has can be queried for, and is a quick way to select things. And if, again, you can query by the default conditions. The text fields that are in patch that you enter are represented in the second tab. I want to query by text, all of front of house, all of, whatever query or whatever text fields you put on that channel in patch, and then query by fixture types. So this, again, is another tool available to you if you're not that familiar with it, that will help you select lights based on what they're doing. So I just want to quickly touch on, you guys are pretty much all familiar with this, but I think it's worth just refreshing because I think we do have some people that are new to the platform and perhaps new to using moving lights. There are some things that have come along over time that are specifically have entered our lexicon because of moving light control. And the first is reference data. I think everybody knows that reference data is basically building blocks, and this came to us from early Vari-Light consoles because it's really tedious every time you want the light down stage left to have to pan and tilt it down stage left. So then there was the idea of how that if we made this bucket, and we're going to call that bucket DSL, and then every time I want the lights to go there, I call for the bucket, and I don't have to keep panning and tilting the lights into the same position over and over and over again. And the advantage, obviously, of reference data is if you modify it, it will be modified throughout the cue list or submaster list, wherever that reference has been used, hence the name referenced. EOS has 4 different types: intensity, focus, color, beam. They are filtered. We don't allow you to put color data into a focus palette. If you want to have reference data that is blended, that's what presets are for. In other consoles, that's going to be called an all palette. There are many consoles that allow you to put any kind of data into any bucket that you want. We made the decision not to do that because you don't have to worry about filtering so much. So when I'm storing color data, I don't have to worry about storing anything but color data in my color palettes. Again, good decision, bad decision. It was a decision. Again, most consoles are going to have something similar to this. Reference data can be locked. So if you have a focus palette that you don't want to have changed on a generic update, and we're going to get into updating a little bit later in detail, you can lock it. And the only way to update a locked palette is specifically, these channels update this palette. It cannot, if you just hit update enter, it will not be changed. Reference data can also have a make absolute flag, and that is intended primarily for intensity palettes. You want a quick way to get a bucket on stage, but you don't want to see the reference. You want to see the actual value. So you can set a flag for palettes that will basically recall it and turn it into absolute data. We use the phrase absolute data for anything that's numeric. It hasn't gotten there through a palette. And then we have by type functions. Which, again, on the stock consoles have by type or global. We will someday deal with global palettes. I think you can see with 3.0 and augmented moving us toward that, where global focus palettes would be really useful. So just that's a quick thing on reference data. Filtering is, again, something that people might not be familiar with because it came to us from not through our historic legacy path, but through moving light control. Filtering, again, was introduced by Vari-Light. Because Vari-Light, the original Vari-Light systems were designed by sound guys, and this made perfect sense to sound people. Filtering is an additional way to store data. If you want to filter to only color, for this period of time, the only thing I care about is color data, rather than consistently saying record color or color record or whatever the syntax is on your desk. You could deploy a color filter, and it will, until you lift that filter state, then that's the only data that can be stored. It's a very common approach. I think that filters are really useful, especially when you're making presets, because it's our beam palettes, because beam is such a big category. Often when you're doing shuttering, you're going to want to deploy an edge control, but you might not want that edge control to be stored in the shutter beam palette. So you could filter down to just your shutter controls. And as you do things with other beam parameters, you don't have to worry about that data being stored into your shutter palettes. It's similar to selective store. You could do the same thing from the command line. These channel shutters record. And if it's a one-off, it's faster to do it from the command line. But if you're doing a set of, rotation palettes or zoom palettes or shutter palettes, it's faster and easier to throw a filter on, lift the filter when you're done. When we added fader config tools, or maybe the release after, I can't completely recall, we also added the ability to put filters on faders, on playback faders. The advantage of that is if you built a big cue list, and this isn't a theatrical thing, it's more of a live event thing, and you've decided that for this particular show, you only want the color data from this cue list. Instead of deleting all that information out, you can throw a filter on it and say, until I lift the filter, the only thing that can be played back from this list is going to be the color data, or whatever filter, or channel filter. So the other feature that it came to us from moving light control is marking. And marking is the ability to preset a light so that when you bring its intensity up, it's going to come up in the color beam focus that you need in it for that particular cue, rather than it moving into position at the same time. The way it was dealt with previously was you would, you bring the light up, you put it where you need it, and then you kill it, record it. Not almost every desk supports some level of marking. EOS has two different styles, which again, a lot of desks are going to give you the option. We do auto marking, which basically says anytime the light is fading from 0 to a value and it has non-intensity moves, execute those non-intensity moves in the immediately preceding cue. Every desk has a feature like this. They call it different things: move while dark, move before bright, whatever. The rules are also different from one console to another as to, does it mark to its earliest potential location? Does it mark to the immediately preceding location? So you kind of have to know on whatever platform you're using what rule it's following. And then all desks will allow you to turn it off so that you can get a live move instruction if you want it. We also have a function called reference marking. MA has a very similar function. Reference marking allows you to determine where the light should come up, or where the light should be marked. And it's basically a reverse track instruction, if you want to think of it that way. So I bring up the light in Q10, I set it to the color and the position I need it, and I need it to move into that position in Q5 because that's a big noisy part of the show. Just while you have those channels selected, mark Q5, enter, is how it works. And then in a perfect world, what would happen would be, sorry, I used the wrong Q numbers. Let's say I had marked those in Q6, back to Q3. In the PSD, you'll see an R. That's your reference Q. The M represents your mark queue. And what that tells me is for Q6, there's stuff that's stored in this queue that's actually going to be executed somewhere else. Q3 tells me there's a mark instruction here. I am going to be moving things that are not stored in me. This is where the about window and all those display toggles come in really handy, because it will tell you all of this information if you can't remember. When you apply a mark flag, you'll get an M next to the channels that are marked. Channel parameters, because you can mark at a parameter level. They'll be green when they're marked appropriately, for some reason that we decided a long time ago that I can't really remember. But this is basically, now the advantage of this is when I get to Q6, the light turns on, voila, everything is perfect, the lights are exactly where I want them. Oh wait, no, I need this in a different color. Now all I have to do is change the color and update Q6. I don't have to worry about changing it in Q3, which is where it actually moves to that color palette. So I only have to worry about the data in the cues that the lights are in use. So it just kind of streamlines the process a little bit. I think most of you are familiar with that. Here's what will happen. In a perfect world, it will look like this. It's not the way it really works, though. What's going to really happen is somewhere between Q3 and 6, you're going to need that light, probably, or maybe. You're going to take the light and you're going to use it, and then maybe you're going to turn it right back off. EOS will auto mark for you if the light is, if the light that was in a marked state is used and then is made inactive again, we will auto mark it for you. But what you'll see there next to Q5, there's an X in the marks flag field, and that tells you that that is a broken mark. You took a light that was in use, and we still marked it for you, but maybe it's not marking where you want it to mark. So it's just a little indication. You should maybe check and see if this is what you really want. And then if you look at channel 6 in the screenshot below, there's a blue X. That tells you this light is still marked, but it's not the mark that you originally set. Maybe it's fine. Maybe you want to mark it someplace else. So we try to give you an indicator when we've made a decision on your behalf. Hopefully that makes sense. And we'll answer questions about this because I'm sure there will be some. Actually, let's stop now and see if there are any questions before we move on to updating.
So let's see. Some somewhat related questions for where we are right now. Tyler would like to know, what's the least destructive way to clean up dark moves?
Blind @enter commands. So, you know, to me, and I'll be interested to see what Nick and Rob have to say, but I would, when you see the dark move flag, I think the least disruptive way to do it is go to blind, go to that queue in blind, query for dark moves. It's going to return a channel selection of everything that has a dark move on it. And then after you look at it to make sure it's what you want to do, @enter.
Yeah, I still do a couple of shows a year, and that's exactly what I do. Is anytime I get a little bit of a break, I'm popping into blind and cleaning up. Right? You know, we're constantly moving so quickly, getting things up and down, that the fastest way and the least. And this will kind of answer another question as well that I saw in the Q&A. You know, you have the blind spreadsheet view in blind, which is incredibly useful for seeing what's going to happen, right? So you can go in, as Ann said, @enter. This is where a macro for query dark moves is really useful, right? So you can pop in, go into a queue range, and get rid of stuff.
You can do it live as well, right? You can query for dark moves in live, but you didn't have to store them. So it kind of depends on where you are in the process. If you are in a queue that you have dark moves in and you've got the time, query for dark moves, @enter, update enter. But it really, we find that certainly in most of our core markets, a lot of that work gets done in blind because it's not so disruptive.
Yeah, I'll tack on and say I have a macro that does, I forget exactly what it is, but it's basically query dark moves and then select last, and then the macro also puts me into a flexi view where it only shows me those channels.
Oh.
And then I manually, because I'm paranoid and OCD, I want to manually fix it myself, just in case. Like, I don't want it doing all that work for me because I want to know exactly what it's doing. But I know a lot of programmers kind of have their own method of making a macro to do some or all or combination of those steps. But I also do it in blind, for whatever that's worth.
I'd like to hit this question because I think it's important in case there are people who are getting lost in where we are in this conversation. Connor asks, isn't a mark the same as a dark move? Both are a case of a light's non-intensity parameters changing so that they are prepared for the fixture to come on, right?
They can be. I mean, and certainly the old style of before marking functions came along, that was exactly what it was, right? If I knew that I needed to preset these things in Q3, I would put those values in Q3 and have the light turned off, and that would result in a dark move instruction. So they are the same. One is by design or intent, and one is perhaps not.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, especially dealing with larger and larger LED rigs and moving light rigs, the system knows the difference between a mark, which is intentional, and a dark move, which, again, as Ann said, is often unintentional. You know, designers like to do what I call audition a light, and sometimes that gets stored in certain places, or you're moving quickly and you've forgotten to take off move instructions and the light's out. Whereas a mark is something that is said, I intentionally want this light to set itself up for the next time it's on stage, X amount of cues back. And so again, query understands those sorts of things. You know, you can use the tools of the desk because it understands the difference between those two operations. There's a setting in Patch, by the way, on a channel by channel basis. You can disable whether or not a channel contributes to the live moves column, the MV column, and that's really useful. Sometimes, you know, hazers are a perfect example. Like, you don't want to know when those things are moving up and down. So if you want to clean up your live moves column or you don't like seeing that stuff, in Patch, there's a flag that you can set that allows you to turn that stuff off. So check out our videos for that stuff. I think that's in level 2. For the sake of today, we don't need to go into how to do it, but know that it can be done.
I think this is an interesting question. Why do LED color values mark? Is it legacy from scrollers?
Because if you don't, you could be going through undesired colors, I think is the best approach. Yeah. That question, and also because it's a non-intensity parameter and we treat all non-intensity parameters equally, I think it's a viable question. And there, you know, certainly if you had lights that didn't have a virtual intensity, which we always put virtual intensity on LED fixtures, so that you're not having to bring the color to a value to actually get light out. And we do the virtual intensity for those fixtures that don't have it so that they can be treated exactly like any other fixture that has multiple parameters.
I also think it's worth noting that I'm assured that comes from a place of treating LEDs as color changing without thinking about the actual process of change, where it is just, I can get all of these different colors from this fixture, but learning that there is a process in between getting to those colors, I think is another step in that process. And I think that might be part of that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I agree, Sam. And I think that, you know, one of the things that, as Anne was just saying, because we made the decision was made very early on that LED fixtures would have an intensity or virtual intensity, and that we would home all of the colors at full, so that when you hit channel 1 at full, enter light game out of the fixture. When you're fading, if you've not used that light, it's at 0, all the colors are at full. You're trying to fade to a blue, you're going to fade from white as the intensity comes up, as those individual emitters fade down to just be in blue. So marking allows those non-intensity parameters, the colors, to preset themselves before the intensity fades up. So you do need to mark your LEDs just like you would mark your movers, or else you can go from white to because of additive mixing, we need to subtract colors to get to a mixed color.
Okay, anything else, Sam?
I think we should move ahead and then we'll try and grab stuff at the end. I just want to make sure we have enough time.
Thank you, sir. So the next big thing to hit is update. Update is often referred to as a faith-based function. But if you understand update, it's incredibly powerful once you trust it. It has a complex rule set, but it's a very consistent rule set, or we try to make it as consistent as we possibly can. A lot of people still don't use it, which is fine. You can do everything you need to do without it, but kind of like tracking, it's got its places where it's appropriate and speeds things up. So I think it's worth taking a cruise through this. So one of the things that we do is when you hit the update key, an update, as we know, is re-recording. You can't update to a non-existent record target. We have an update dialog box that will expose to you, if I proceed with this update, exactly what am I updating, and it will tell you the queue number, any reference data that's involved. We still have some work to, full disclosure as always, we have some work to do with this, with exposing effects that is high on our priority list. You can deselect things or select things from this box and update only what you choose. Update, one of the things about update is when you, if you have multiple sources on stage, multiple queue lists and multiple subs, whatever, and you update, everything will update back to its source. So if you've made changes to a bunch of different record targets and you hit update, Anything that you override from sub 1 goes back to sub 1. If you overrode it from Q list 5, Q12, it goes back to that list. So it knows what its source was, and it updates itself back there accordingly. You can force things to update to different locations via the command line, this channel color, update to the source. If you have something that is totally unowned, it's brand new, it will, by default, unless you tell us differently, it will update to the selected queue list. So you guys know that, we always track the selected list based on the last go button that you hit. We assume that that's the queue list you're working with. So anything that's new to the picture that hasn't been in use before, if you don't tell us differently, that's where we're going to dump that data. And this little handy update dialog box actually tells you that, which is quite handy. You have a bunch of update modifiers that we're going to walk through because, again, those are confusing for people, I think, the first time they use this. In setup, on a per user basis, you define what your defaults are, your preferred way to update. And when you hit update, it's going to give you those preferences highlighted in gold so you know what it was you chose. You can pick other options as a temporary override. So you have update style, which is all make absolute and ref only. We're going to come back to these. And then you have modifiers to that, which is last reference and break nested. So let's just, and as you hit those buttons, by the way, the content of the update dialog box will show you that. It will modify the data to show you exactly what's going to be changed at the point that you hit the update or the enter key. So your update options, update all, make absolute, and references only. Update all basically says update everything that I'm using. So if I have, and let's just take a simple example of one queue on stage with 5 different palettes. I've modified some manual data, or some absolute data, sorry. I've modified some of the palette data as well, so I have a little R that tells me I've overridden a reference. When I hit update all, I'm going to be storing not just data into the queue, but I'm also modifying any references that were used in that queue. It is the most powerful way to update. It basically says, everybody that's being used, update yourself accordingly. It is, however, not the safest way to update. And in usual fashion, EOS defaults to the most powerful way to use a feature. That's why we update to tracking, default to tracking. We default to reference marking on, not auto mark on. But because update, first of all, it happens in a hurry. It is the key on the desk that is the most used other than the enter key. You have very little time to think. So we, by default, unless you tell us differently in setup, we will update make absolute. And what that is it will update the data in the queue, but it will break any references. So if I had a light in focus palette 12, which is the sofa, and I change that, the pan and tilt values, and then hit update make absolute, I'm going to maintain my pan and tilt as set, but I will break the reference to the sofa focus palette. Again, you can always go back and fix it later. It is the safest way to do things, not necessarily the fastest way. And we can come back to that if necessary. And then update references only. I always have to be reminded of this. It's kind of a European thing, or it came to us, I should say, not a European thing, but came to us from the European market. Update references only is kind of useful if you're in a queue state or whatever, and someone says, oh, I noticed a problem earlier with Focus Palette 12, and you're not actually using Focus Palette 12. You could bring Focus Palette 12 on some lights on stage, fix it, and update just that and not impact the queue that you're working with. So it's kind of a utility tool that lets you do things that you might not be using at the moment. So those are your basic choices. Do I want to update everything I'm using? Do I want to update and break any references I'm using? And do I want to update only the reference data that's in use, or do I want to update the queue as well? And obviously, you can do this selectively. These channels, this queue, right? So you have a lot of finesse in how deep you go here. So those are your options. And then in terms of your modifiers, there are 2 key ones, which is update last reference and update break nested. I want to talk about break nested first because it's the easiest of the 2 to understand, I think. So because it is possible in a preset that you could have palette data. And this is something that programmers, you have to, they think about a lot, how the data is going to be structured. Anytime you have data within data within data, you have to give a lot of thought to how that's going to be structured and how it's going to be used later. And this is where locked palettes come into play, because we see a lot of programmers who use presets very heavily because you can blend any sort of data in them, but they use palettes as a building block in those presets. And they'll frequently lock those palettes so that they cannot be modified accidentally. Update break nested is another way to manage that. So let's say that I've got a preset that has focus palette 12 in it, and I didn't lock focus palette 12. So I have absolute data in focus palette 12. Focus palette 12 is then built into this preset, and then this preset is then used in this queue, and this queue is now on stage. And then I modify something. What I want to do is I want to update, I could update make absolute and break all my references, but I want to update the preset because I'm only using the preset in this queue, and I don't want it to modify the palette that the preset was built on. And that's what break nested lets you do. It lets you pull the data out of the palette and put it directly in the preset and not have to worry about changing that building block by mistake. I'm sure that there will be questions about that. We'll get to them. What update last reference does, and usually when I do this in front of people, I use humans because I like to anthropomorphize things. Let's assume that I'm in Q1 and this, channel 1, I can't remember number, so it's in color palette 1. And that's what is actually stored in the queue. It's color palette 1. And then I go, oh, the design, something less saturated, so then I go to color palette 2. So I meant, this channel color palette 2, and it's manual. And then I tweak the color. So now I've done 2 things to color from what was stored in the queue, which is color palette 1. Now, normally what you would do is if you wanted that tweaked color, you're probably going to store that as a different color palette. And then you would just update the queue. But let's say you didn't do that, and you just hit update all. What is it actually going to be updating? You had stored in the queue color palette 1, you manually replaced it with color palette 2, and then you tweaked color palette 2. What's actually going to be modified on an update all command is color palette 1, because that is what is stored in the queue. If you wanted to actually update color palette 2 and store color palette 2 in the queue, you update all last reference. Hopefully that makes sense. We'll get to that when we have questions, which we're coming to soon. Then obviously when you're updating, you also have queue only options. Update, don't let it track forward to the queue list. Update trace lets you go back. So if I'm in the middle of a scene and I make a change and I know I want to make that change to this entire scene, instead of going, where did this start? You could do the scene break thing, but okay, this began at Q10, you have to know to update Q10, which you can do, by the way, even though you're not in Q10. Or I can just hit update trace, and basically that says, go back and find the source of this move instruction and change it there. So those are your different update commands. And I think, Sam, we should take a quick break just because update is a lot, and we went through it quickly.
Okay, update question. Can update only target channels changed by that user? So if someone is remote testing practical amps off stage, they don't get updated into random queues. Based
on partition control, right? And we're going to hit that a little bit. And next week, Nick is doing a thing on this. If channels are outside of your partition, when you do an update or a record, those channels are not included by default. That is the exact purpose of partition control, which is a user setting. So the safest way to not have those things come into queue list inadvertently would be to put that person, whoever they are, as a different user and give them a different partition.
So there's a lot of discussion on both sides of basically wondering about kind of the malleability of auto marking. I mean that in a lot of questions saying, is it possible to set only these fixtures to mark this way, but these to mark a different way, or to have mark only apply to something or not apply to something? Yeah. Can you talk about the reasoning behind the choices we've made with that?
First of all, right now, the answer to the question is no. What you can do, and we see this happening a lot, is early in the tech process, put the desk in auto mark mode. That way you don't have to worry about it, and lights will just mark themselves. And then later, when you're looking for finesse, if you turn reference marking on, it would automatically take all of those auto marks that already existed, convert them to referenced marks, and then you could just move marks where you needed them, where the marking was, not advantageous because of noise considerations or whatever. In terms of blending, and this has come up a lot, it's a really good question. I will tell you, and I see Nick Simmons is on this. Hi, Nick, who is an early influencer for us in the mark functionality. This is incredibly complex code that makes this work the way that it works. And there is rarely a release that goes by that we don't fix or add something to marking. We have been, because of the complexity of the software, we have been relatively reluctant to introduce more complexity by allowing that level of blending. I'm not saying that we will never do it, but I think what we have talked about, because this has come up a lot, is to get this feature as currently designed to a completely stable place and then see where we want to take it. I think is the best answer I have at the moment, unless Nick or Rob have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I envision a world in the year 3000 where the desk always does the heavy lifting for you, like AutoMark does, except when you don't want it to, and then you can make changes and you can manage that move and those transitions like reference marking does. As Ann said, though, this is incredibly complex code. There's a lot of difficulties. We do a lot of stuff, and I don't remember if you touched on this, Ann. We do a lot of stuff which I call under the heading of go to queue nicely. Things like, oh, you're going to talk about out of sequence queues and stuff. When
you're on the topic now. Go ahead and hit it.
Yeah, when you go out of sequence, the board automatically does some things with lights that are off that are coming on to the new place you're going. We do some auto-marky stuff there. The board kind of does a lot of really nice features, and Mark is kind of tied into that stuff. So I think in the long term, I don't think anybody would say that Mark's great exactly the way it is and we want it to live like this for forever. Yeah. The board should be able to do some more heavy lifting. Right now, there's a lot of other priorities that we want to get to with the small development team that we have. I think that's a fair statement. And so, getting around to some of those bigger features isn't in our immediate future, but it's something that long term, getting some more nuances there are great. There's some hacks around Mark that we can talk about at a different time. It's off topic for today, but there's a lot of macros and things that you can do to make Mark behave a little bit better. The power of Mark, if you're doing reference marking, is that you can do it on a per parameter basis. So there's things that you can play with to make it a bit easier.
Yeah, there's absolutely no reason though that reference marking and auto marking can't coexist. Like there's nothing logically that says they can't coexist. It's just something we haven't tackled yet, as Nick said, because A, we have other priorities at the moment, and B, we wanted to get this relatively stable and not have issues with it before we add anything to it. So, yeah.
Just to answer a couple, there's just one kind of other question that is coming up a bunch that is related, which is people asking about mark earliest within AutoMark.
Yes.
Basically, is that possible?
Why don't we do that? The reason that we don't, and again, good, bad decisions, they're just different. We mark to the immediately preceding queue because we don't like the ideas of marks moving around a lot. And when you mark, again, this is no pejorative statement to anyone who has chosen a different behavior. There is a predictability and a comfort in knowing exactly where an auto mark is going to happen. Mark earliest could be just as inconvenient of a location as mark immediately preceding. So we keep data from constantly being shuffled around through your queue sheet as you are building your show, as it does, we know. We just made the decision to mark to the immediately preceding queue.
I think we should get through the rest of the slides because we're running pretty short on time. Do we want to say now that we're hopefully going to be looking to have a more formal setting to answer, because we realize there are a lot of questions about a lot of this content because we've gone over so much. And so we want to have a forum to deal with this stuff.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll get through the topic in the next 9 minutes, and then all the questions that are on here are functional and are less theoretical. So I'd like to get through the content that Anne's prepared. I certainly will stick around and answer some of these questions after we're done. But I think also maybe setting up like an open office hours event in the future would be really good, you know, so that you can get some of these functional questions answered that are less to do with the theory and more to do with like, why does this work this way, or how can I get it to work this way? So we'll get through this. We'll try and answer a lot of those questions after we're done at 1 Eastern in case anybody has to leave. And then we'll look for opportunities in the future to host an event that's a bit more tactical. So
yeah, we had talked about, and there's a link to it that I don't think is actually working at the moment, which is an Instagram kind of office hours, ask me anything. It's in work, but I think that might be the place to do this that is the most efficient.
Yeah.
It's just you know, we have a lot of people who are not on social media, so using the Facebook page for the As Programmers group is useful, but it doesn't hit everyone. But we'll give some thought to that. I just want to quickly go through these things because we are out of time, but I think we're all willing to stick around to answer questions. Selective storing, we pretty much hit on. Selective storing is just sort of another method to control what you're storing. It's in addition to filters, it's in addition to the rules that we already have for record and record only. These channels, you know, color, record here. These channels minus intensity, record here. It's when you are selective storing to an existing target, you're merging the data. It's not a replacement. It's something, again, that if you're not familiar completely with how selective storing works, but you find yourself often in a need to control because of the number of inputs that you might have at any given point during playback, it's something that you should become familiar with. Out of sequence queues, Nick did allude to this. We have a lot of rules. We have a lot of rules for how we manage multiple inputs and what we do when those inputs are taken in different orders. We consider any of the following things to be out of sequence queues. A go to queue instruction, when you change a queue in pending either manually or because you've linked to a queue. Queues that are executed via the execute list are all considered out of sequence queues. Out of sequence queues have a different rule set than in sequence queues. By default, an out of sequence queue will replay the entirety of the queue. It doesn't replay, it doesn't follow just the move fade rule. It basically acts as state. I want to replay, I need this state back in its entirety. So anything that might have taken control away, even if there are move instructions, even if there are tracks, I want those tracks to be asserted so that I get this look in its entirety. That is the fundamental rule for anything that's out of sequence. So just to be aware of that. One of the things that often is confusing for people is, what about manual levels? There's a lot of logic that goes into this. So if you have, let's say I have 2 queue lists on stage at the time, they're completely separate channel lists because I'm doing an event and, you know, this is the haunted house over here and this is the pumpkin patch over here. Kudos to Pete, now that I understand. If I do an out of sequence move on one queue list, if I don't have any channels shared between the two, any manual overrides of the second queue list are completely not impacted. So if I've got stuff in my secondary queue list that I've manually changed, and I do an action on the other queue list here, it's going to leave those manual levels intact. If I have any of those channels, though, in this queue stack over here, sorry, as I try to gesture, those manual levels will be removed, and the lights will go to what's stored in this queue list that I'm doing my out of sequence move on. Hopefully that makes sense. And that is utterly by design, because I'm telling it to go to this queue, I need those channels back. If you have unowned manual levels, so I've got lights that I've brought up that don't belong to either queue list, when I do something out of sequence, those will go out. Again, that is unless you capture them. That is by design. That is because if I want to go to Q5, I don't want to have to manually go and remove these dangly bits to get rid of them. We are looking at some options for that over time. One of the ways that most of our programmers manage this, though, is by storing everything that they want to belong to a queue list in the first queue, and that makes it much more clear. Yes, that's the belongs to what. So there are concepts of queue list ownership that if you're working in a multiple queue list environment, you want to be pretty up on so that you're not trying to figure out how to keep lights from doing things you don't want them to do. One of the things we added recently is a channel level release flag. You can null data, but you can also say, at this point in the queue list, I am done with these channels. I want them to return to their background state, and until I call them back into the queue list, they are not considered owned by this queue list. So that's another tool that could be handy to you based on the kind of show you might be programming. And as Nick said, we have a lot of tools for trying to go to queue nicely so that we're not causing disruption on stage. The last thing really to talk about, and I'm not going to get into this in any detail because I'm going to plug Nick's thing for next week. EOS does support partitions and other consoles. It's called worlds that you might be familiar with. Partition control basically determines what any user can store. I can control anything. The desk. Let's say that we've got the rig partitioned. Nick is the conventional programmer. Rob is doing video, and I'm doing moving lights. We partition the rig, so by default, all I can control is moving lights. If Rob steps away from his desk for some reason and something has to happen, I can still get control of his lights. The desk will ask for confirmation. Light is out of partition. Do you want to control it? Yes, I do. Thank you very much. But I still can't store it until that partition is removed. Partitions are incredibly useful if you are dealing in a multiple programmer environment, but they're also useful if you're dealing with not wanting cross-pollination between your queue lists. So partitions can be applied to queue lists so that if partition 5, which is, let's say, just front of house, is on queue list 1, I can't recall anything from that queue list that doesn't match that partition. They're sort of similar to channel filters, but not entirely. Nick is going to cover this all next week in his session at 11 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. One of the things we're seeing that we kind of didn't anticipate is the explosion of control devices on the network. Once Puck was out there, which is our little mini computer, they're everywhere. We see people putting pucks in stage manager locations in follow spot booths and building queue lists that do nothing but label queues and provide notes for the spot operator that are linked to a main queue list so that their queue list is always being kept updated, and all they have to do is read the screen to tell them what their pickup notes are. That's caused, an interesting challenge in many ways for us that we are dealing with, especially when show control is involved. But some of our shows are now running up to 30 clients, which is not something that we really had anticipated at the very beginning. But Nick will get into all of that next week, and I'm coming in under the wire here at 1 minute. So that's going to be next week, Central Daylight Time or Eastern, or 11 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. Nick had asked, I did want to quickly, so on the study hall page under My ETC, there are links for both ETC and high-end education. The other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is next week we are launching a new thing called the Billington Files. It's actually under a program called ETC on Headset. We've had a lot of requirement over time for how can I exercise my muscle memory? How can I make sure I'm fast enough? So once you know the theory, then it's about getting your speed up so that you can keep up. The Billington Files were taped a while back when Ken was doing Encores at City Center, which is a Broadway review in New York. It's an incredibly quick turnaround. We basically picked up the audio feed from Clearcom and then edited that, and we have accompanying show files. This isn't, the idea behind the Billington Files isn't to teach you how to use the console. It's, you know how to use the console, and now you're just responding to a professional lighting designer who is in the heat of battle and trying to make sure that you know where everything is and you can keep up with him. It's not about, does your effect look exactly like our effect looks, right? So keep an eye out for that. We will post on social media and various other locations when those files are available. Other than that, in terms of resources, there's not a lot of stuff that talks about console theory in any textbooks that I have found, but most of the manufacturers' products that you work with will cover a lot of this in their manual. So look for it in our manual, look for it in the manual of whatever console you happen to be using, and hopefully that will help you out if there are questions. So, and now it's 12:01, so I think we're going to open up for questions for anyone who can still hang around. But thank you all. Thank you for your time. I hope this was useful. It's a difficult concept or thing to talk about in many ways, and especially hard digitally, but hopefully it helped. Okay, Sam.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Anne. So that'll conclude our official session here. I know a lot of you have commented that you're heading over to the HOG session, so please enjoy that one with Megan and Noah to talk about the programmer. For anyone who wants to continue to stick around, we will try and go through. There's currently 45 unanswered questions, so we'll see how many of these we can get through. So we'll begin our bonus question time here.
Yeah,
right, Sam, what do you got for us?
Before we dig into some of this stuff, just because there's been some tactical questions, all of this stuff will be posted on the study hall page, so go there. It views WebEx, and it takes about 24 hours for them to turn over this content to us, and then it takes us and our web team some time to get it there. So that's going to be the logistics of that. But yeah, thanks.